Hello everybody! Today the theme of our lection is the World Trade Organization. Part 1. Nature and History. The World Trade Organization, or WTO, is the only global international organization dealing with the rules of trade between nations. At its heart are the WTO agreements, negotiated and signed by the bulk of the world's trading nations and ratified in their parliaments. The goal is to ensure that the trade flows as smoothly, predictably, and freely as possible. There are a number of ways of looking at the WTO. It's an organization for liberalizing trade. It's a forum for governments to negotiate trade agreements. It's a place for them to settle trade disputes. It operates a system of trade rules, but it's not a Superman, just in case anyone thought it could solve or cause all the world's problems. Above all, it's a negotiating forum. Essentially, the WTO is a place where member governments go to try to sort out the trade problems they face with each other. The first step is to talk. The WTO was born out of negotiations, and everything the WTO does is the result of negotiations. The bulk of the WTO's current work comes from the 1986-1994 negotiations called the Uruguay Round, and earlier negotiations under the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, GATT. The WTO is currently the host to new negotiations under the Doha Development Agenda launched in 2001. Where countries have faced trade barriers and wanted them lowered, the negotiations have helped liberalize trade. But the WTO is not just about liberalizing trade, and in some circumstances its rules support maintaining trade barriers. For example, to protect consumers or prevent the spread of disease. The heart of the WTO are the agreements negotiated and signed by the bulk of the world's trading nations. These documents provide the legal ground rules for international commerce. They are essentially contracts binding governments to keep their trade policies within agreed limits. The system's overriding purpose is to help trade flow as freely as possible, so long as there are no undesirable side effects. Free trade, as widely known, is important for economic development and well-being. On one hand, it means removing obstacles. On the other hand, it means ensuring that individuals, companies and governments know what the trade rules are around the world. That gives them the confidence that there will not be sudden changes of policy. In other words, the rules have to be transparent and predictable. Trade relations often involve conflicting interests. Agreements, including those painstakingly negotiated in the WTO system, often need interpreting. The most harmonious way to settle these differences is through some neutral procedure based on an agreed legal foundation. The World Trade Organization officially commenced on the 1st of January 1995 under the Marrakesh Agreement signed by 123 nations on the 15th of April 1994, replacing the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, GATT, which commenced in 1948. The World Trade Organization derives most of the income for its annual budget from contributions by its members. These are established according to a formula based on their share of international trade. Miscellaneous income is earned from rental fees and sales of the WTO print and electronic publications. The WTO also manages a number of trust funds which have been contributed by members. These are used in support of special activities for technical cooperation and training meant to enable least developed and developing countries to make better use of the World Trade Organization and draw greater benefit from the multilateral trading system. Here you can see the map of member countries. Countries observers and non-members of the World Trade Organization. With 164 member countries, it is the largest international entirely economic organization in the world. So, while the World Trade Organization is still young, the multilateral trading system that was originally set up under GATT is well over 50 years old. The WTO's creation in 1995 marked the biggest reform of international trade since after the Second World War. It also brought to reality, in an updated form, the failed attempt in 1948 to create an international trade organization. The original intention was to create a third institution to handle the trade side of international economic cooperation, joining the two Bretton Woods institutions, the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund. The economist Harry White, on the left, and John Maynard Keynes both had been strong advocates of a central controlled international trade environment. Over 50 countries participated in negotiating to create the International Trade Organization (ITO) as a specialized agency of the United Nations. The draft of ITO Charter was ambitious. It extended beyond world trade disciplines to include rules on employment, commodity agreements, restrictive business practices, international investment and services. The aim was to create the International Trade Organization at a United Nations Conference on Trade and Employment in Havana, Cuba, in 1947. Meanwhile, 15 countries had begun talks in December 1945 to reduce and bind custom tariffs. With the Second World War only recently ended, they wanted to give an early boost to trade liberalization and to begin to correct the legacy of protectionist measures which remained in place from the early 1930s. This first round of negotiations resulted in a package of trade rules and 45,000 tariff concessions, effective $10 billion of trade, about 1/5 of the world's total that time. The group had expanded to 23 by the time the deal was signed on the 30th of October 1947. The tariff concessions came into effect by the 13th of June 1948 through a protocol of provisional application. And so the new General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade was born, with 23 founding members. Officially they were called contracting parties. The Havana Conference began on the 21st of November 1947, less than a month later after GATT was signed. The International Trade Organization Charter was finally agreed in Havana in March 1948, but ratification in some national legislatures proved impossible. So the GATT became the only multilateral instrument governing international trade from 1948 until the World Trade Organization was established in 1995. For almost half a century, the GATT's basic legal principles remained much as they were in 1948. There were additions in the form of a section on development added in the 1960s and plurilateral agreements, that is, with voluntary membership, in the 1970s, and efforts to reduce tariffs further continued. Much of this was achieved through a series of multilateral negotiations known as trade rounds. In the early years, the GATT trade rounds concentrated on further reducing tariffs. Then, the Kennedy Round in the mid-60s brought about a GATT anti-dumping agreement and a section on development. The Tokyo Round during the 70s was the first major attempt to tackle trade barriers that do not take the form of tariffs and to improve the system. The eighth, the Uruguay Round of 1986-1994, was the last and most extensive of all. It led to the WTO and a new set of agreements. The current round of negotiations is the Doha Development Round, which was launched in 2001 with an explicit focus on developing countries. GATT was provisional with a limited field of action, but its success over 47 years in promoting and securing the liberalization of much of world trade is incontestable. The past 50 years have seen an exceptional growth in world trade. Merchandise exports grew on average by 6% annually. Total trade in 2000 was 22 times the level of the 1950. GATT and the WTO have helped to create a strong and prosperous trading system contributing to unprecedented growth. This is the end of the first part of our lection about the World Trade Organization. Thank you for your attention.